Here we go. Great to be with everybody. Hey, I'm going to talk into the blackness of the internet here by myself since I can't see any of your faces, but I know you're there with me on chat. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. I'm going to be prototyping here with you. The idea of my presentation is around culture change being easier when you prototype it rather than focusing on change, just focusing on prototyping it. And I'm going to spend about 15 minutes, I think, trying to ground everything in some business sensibility. And then, I think I'll probably try and be clever and creative for a little bit before I'm practical and just give you kind of what the overview approach is to using prototypes as a way to help change culture. How does that sound? If everybody just to give me a yes in the chat, just so I know people are there and it made sense. Sounds good. Thank you. All right, here we go. So hopefully with this presentation, it'll help remove much of the confusion around culture change. And I suspect everyone on here listening in is a student and a practitioner of culture change. So you're probably not as confused as the rest of the world and the stakeholders that we have to operate with in order to make some of this change happen. But others might be more confused. So part of the idea of what we're looking at with the confusion that often comes with it, and I'm sure you've heard this too, is in the beginning of a culture project, there's the first question, which is usually, hey, I'm really interested, or my boss is really interested in how our culture compares to other companies. And in the spirit of big picture business kind of understanding, in most cases, I like to reassure people that the good news is I would guess that it's way better than this. And this was a headline from Goldman Sachs earlier this year around conditions being inhumane. So for almost all the companies that we all work with, there's a spectrum of anywhere from quite toxic and maybe inhumane all the way to highly innovative, adaptive, fast moving, fast growing type organizations, right? A spectrum. 99% are not going to be as bad as this. 99% are not going to have this language around inhumane abuse, around 100-hour work weeks, sleep deprivation, a history of actual deaths due to bad work environment conditions. And most won't have the degree or extreme degree of bad situation happening like this one. Now, we've seen in the headlines plenty of tragic culture-related company stories, the Boeing stuff, all the way back to the Enrons. There's no shortage of those things happening. We know that they're happening. And even though, as bad as this sounds, when we look at this Goldman Sachs type culture, from the article, I don't know anything about it, I don't know how true it is or not, but this is from the article that was reported. Either way, no matter how bad this sounds, for some people, some of our stakeholders, it sounds really bad to you unless to you, culture means money. Culture means payment. Culture could be for some related to how we pay people. If the organization believes that culture is all about how we treat the things that individuals here care about most, money, fulfillment, satisfaction, achievement, the list goes on and on that could be possible things that we care about most, we're still in the right boat, or still in the right kind of neighborhood if we're focused on how do we treat the things that individuals here care about most. So let's not worry too much about being on the extreme side of it. But while we're staying close into the very professional, high-end business kind of category of conversation here, I would ask, and I'll make it rhetorical so you don't have to put this in chat, but the question I often ask is, hey, what's evolving in 2021 conversations between companies, investors, and analysts? So if we're thinking of equity research analysts, and we're thinking of quarterly earnings reports, something is actually happening that's pretty interesting with relation to the conversations that are coming about that are different. In my experience, and it could be a very limited experience, you may have a different experience. In my experience, what's new and interesting as I'm listening to some of these, and interacting with analysts and listening into some of these reports where the CEO, chief sales officer, chief strategy officer, COO are getting on there and talking to the analysts, and they're starting to, different from before, talk about emerging metrics around intangibles such as environmental, social, and governance, like that, and DEI, and even culture to a different degree. Maybe last year or a few years ago, that stuff would never come up on any of these calls. And I'm not saying it's coming up to page 1 or page 2 or page 3 of the presentation, but it's certainly coming up more often than not. The way it's coming up, though, in those conversations, and specifically, I'm not going to talk about environmental, social, and governance. I'm not going to talk about DEI coming up in those reports. Since we're here to talk about culture, let's just focus there on how that conversation comes up. And largely, in my experience, it comes up around some commentary or some intention setting from the CEO that's linking, the description of a culture that everyone wants to be a part of in connection to winning the war for talent. Like there's this tremendous effort on attracting and retaining the best talent out there, especially in high tech, all the industries that are on fire. How do they get and keep the best talent? So most of the conversations about culture are describing some connection to that, some vision for being the destination for the best talent. However, those conversations that the CXOs are having, I don't find it to be very technical. I like, in the same way that there's a technical expertise around any business function, I don't hear that in the culture conversations. I don't hear very data-driven or analytical description or dialogue related to culture. And I certainly don't see any direct connection to the very tangible benefits that come from focusing on culture, from building a constructive culture. The whole idea of correlations to growth, risk, adaptability, innovation, learning, survival, etc. Those things don't come up. There's a nice picture painted and some voice from the CEO saying, we have a great culture here, and we've built new buildings and yada, yada, like lots of different ways to describe why it's so great, but not a lot of correlation to the business benefits of it. Now, everybody here, big believers in this idea that culture eats strategy. Forget that, culture eats everything, like a big believer in it being the platform for growth and adaptability and all the things we say we want. And most of us here also probably work with or are a part of companies that are explicitly saying that 2021, and this is from a Deloitte Global Human Capital Trend Survey, that the majority of companies are working on culture. They're, as far as transforming work, 45% are building an organizational culture that celebrates growth, adaptability, and resilience. So where that is expected, where those things are present in the environment to help drive growth, adaptability, and resilience. So people are working on it. Not a lot of discussion about it or direct correlation to it. And for those of us who aren't in the conversations that are big believers in how strong culture is and how strong it works, and why it's not on the first 1, 2, 3 pages of the analyst report or the earnings report, is often because of these underlying beliefs, assumptions, and narratives that get in the way of elevating the story of culture and therefore culture competency to page 1. So I'm going to talk a lot about culture competency and this idea of CQ, cultural intelligence, culture competency, culture intelligence, being the thing that is the technical understanding, the technical execution of culture, driving all these benefits that we want. What are some of the underlying beliefs that get in the way? Number 1, when leadership says, we know what culture is. Yeah, we're real smart. We've been in business for a long time. Of course we know what it is. Sure, we complain about it all the time, but we got it covered. That's one of the stories that is right away is this a knower mindset that says we know all we need to know about it, but yet it's not where we want it to be. I hear culture is really hard to measure. I hear that culture is a catchphrase for everything. Culture means, when it means everything, it really means nothing, and it's described as fluff. I know you've all heard it be described as fluff. culture change is hard, that all humans resist change, culture change is unlikely to happen, most change programs don't work at all, is the underlying assumption or belief. And then lastly, culture change takes years to move the needle. It's very, very slow. So these underlying narratives are certainly up against us as we're trying to work on culture. And I wrote a number of articles about like who's in charge of people and culture, connecting to this statistic that even 25% of CHROs said that they don't think their role was perceived as important enough, let alone essential inside of the organization. But typically the CHRO is the one who's in charge of culture. And in the spirit of, we got it covered, we know everything we need to know about culture, we're working on it. A lot of these headlines here were intended to kind of help open up the mind a little bit to say, do we have some blind spots here? Is there something getting in the way? We believe it's important, but yet maybe we just aren't paying attention to the right things. And there's a great quote from the Farnham Street blog. If you want to know something that no one else knows, pay careful attention to the things that everyone knows but pays no attention to. So in the spirit of sharing with you what I think are the 5 trends that are growing with regards to culture change, and illuminating this paying careful attention to the things that everybody thinks they knows but pays no attention to, like the blind spot. Here's the trends that are taking us towards the end of the confusion and increased cultural intelligence. Number 1, discouraging myths will be replaced with clarity, simplicity, and competency. Leaders will differentiate between what culture is and what it is not. Leaders will assess both culture and climate with data-driven insights. And 4th, the focus will move from culture cascading to culture prototypes, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And leaders will build mastery in rapid adaptation by reducing friction, reducing fear, in order to accelerate the learning. So those are kind of the trends. That's where it's headed with this new focus and attention on the technical competency of culture. And the spectrum we talked about, from bad to really good, all leaning towards everybody wanting a culture that has it's a speak up culture, it's a take risk culture, try new things, unleash creativity, courage, and intelligence. What kind of intelligence, and how do we get past this generic conversation about culture to the specific strategic levers that help us optimize all of the available intelligences? So all of the available intelligence inside of all the human beings, inside our community of human beings, to boost effectiveness. When we talk about all this intelligence that we want to boost with the platform and the environment, the question is, where does that intelligence come from? What precedes intelligence of any form? If you want to type something in chat, anything comes to mind, what precedes intelligence of any kind? No answers there, but not a trick question, but what comes before intelligence is learning. So the first kind of topic to be more conscious of is there's many social learning theories out there. What is your social learning theory that you buy into? What is the social learning theory that your leadership buys into? Is it behaviorism, right? This idea of the carrot and the stick, positive and negative reinforcement. Is it cognitivism? Is it where you just be open and listen and read, absorb, transmit into me content, and I will learn? Is it connectivism? This idea, especially available now through online learning. How do we build our network of knowledge? How do we approach it from a self-directed way and leverage technology now to help connect all the different types of content that are out there and available to us, a lot more than ever? And humanism, role modeling, observing, and exploring. Which one of these social learning theories are the ones we think of inside of our organization? And I'll use one that we personally believe in. I'm not telling you what to believe in anything you want. Constructivism, to me, is a form of a social learning theory that connects many of these other ones. And they obviously all work in the context of the socio-technical system that is called business. But constructivism is one that anchors in intrinsic motivation, this idea of questioning, this idea of formal and informal exploration and treasure hunting, this idea of collaboration and creating new experiences, shared learning experiences that change meaning, that impact meaning, that we can give meaning to, and then we learn by doing. I'm giving you these social learning theories as a platform or as a basis for going, okay, that makes sense. What is my company's social learning theory that we're obviously investing in and behaving like we believe in? And there's a lot of new examples. So there's some clever stories and metaphors, at least I think they're clever. And there was an article, and many of you have experienced this. I personally experienced it. Many of you have seen or heard this, or maybe you've even done it. I'm pretty sure I'm guilty of this too. But especially now, many organizations got that, got the email like at the end of last month that said, hey, everybody has to report back to the office by Monday. And like with 1 or 2 days notice, some crazy, back to the office type communication protocol. Not every company handled it really well. And the CEO was reportedly going around to different offices, providing donuts as if, and with this note on the donut box saying, welcome back to the office. If you have a good attitude today, have a donut on me. And the article, which was sharing this tidbit and something that we can all kind of connect to, it was titled, will someone please inform Bob that donuts can't fix workplace culture? And it was so insightful, having experienced it, going, what in the world does that leader believe in to think that bringing donuts is going to make this clunky transition from working from home to the office, hybrid, not back and forth, mandates, whatever, all the stuff going on, what's going to make that better? That certainly is not going to do it. Other conversations that highlight to me a lack of cultural intelligence when a company CXO says something like, our culture is our competitive advantage. It's our engagement scores are way up. We definitely have a great culture. All of those things right there highlight to me, they're tells that whoever said this thinks that engagement is the same thing as culture. Whoever said this thinks that we have one culture, a great culture. And the reality is nobody has one great culture. We have many micro cultures, and culture's always working for us and against us. And there's anomalies of under what circumstances and situations the culture is helping us fulfill our mission and accomplish our goals, and other ways that it's working against us. So when I see this, I also think, I was like, what is it? Engagement isn't supposed to be culture for dummies. I know it's not. Engagement's super important. We need to measure engagement. It's very valuable in the context of how we steer the organization. But engagement is not the same thing as culture. Engagement is a climate study. It's not a culture study. They're different. So when I hear and see some of these different stories pop up over and over and over again, I like to talk about it in the context of having a low CQ. Many of the folks that are listening here from the US know this comedian who has, he has the, you might be a something if, kind of a alliteration. So I built that into you might be a culture caveman if you perpetuate some of those things. If you think that culture and engagement are the same thing. If you have difficulty achieving business priorities and blame it on the culture. If you get frustrated versus curious when you talk about culture. If culture means everything, if culture means nothing, you might have a low CQ. And part of the reason for the low CQ, the biggest myth out there is we need to get everybody on board. We need to launch this culture thing and be all in. Let's boost organizational effectiveness. Let's upgrade the company culture, right? This idea of we're all in, we're all going, and we have this tendency to think and build excitement, build commitment. CXO says, I'm all in. Let's do this quickly. We're going to be the next Apple of our industry. The declaration is made. Resources are allocated. Culture committees are appointed. Centers of excellence are promised. Here we go. We are getting ready for takeoff. Expectations are raised. We feel like this souped up, high performance jet ready to go up into the stratosphere to new heights. And unfortunately, that big bang approach doesn't get us the result that we expected or intended. It doesn't look like it's ever going to get off the ground. It's this big bloated thing. So the idea of when we get into culture, when we approach culture, every way that we think about it has to be less about the big bang approach and more about this idea of simplifying, reducing friction, reducing drag so that we can accelerate the learning. So we can boost all the different kinds of intelligence to help us find new ways to interact together and to go about achieving business in more sustainable, more effective, more constructive ways. The Big Bang approach, the influence model that many of you have seen before, I'm not suggesting that this doesn't work. I'm suggesting this is a way of approaching it that has been widely adopted and talked about, but it has very strong contingencies about I will change my behavior and my mindset when and if leaders role model it, when and if I understand what's really being asked of me, when I have all the mechanisms, when I have all the skills. So there's a lot of things like waiting to happen before I will change mine. And often the Big Bang approach focuses on culture teams and plans, very general, focuses on the entire culture, and it's detached from business activities and results. A protect what works and evolve what doesn't approach with prototypes, with a shared learning model, is designed to focus on strategic priorities, problems or goals. It's designed to connect with and be with a very disciplined learning approach and results, and it's intended to improve results in prototypes before we try to change the whole culture, before we try to scale it. So rather than the Big Bang approach, a shared learning model is much more about getting the clarity and alignment up front with data-driven models. Build a coalition of the willing, which means who's ready to try some of these new things to operationalize what we learned in the data, and in the hopefully a very simple model that helps us see where we are versus where we want to go. The coalition of willing are people who want to experiment and try. They're open to learning. If you're not open to learning, there's no room to practice anything new on. So work with the ones who are ready, open, got their hand up in the air, ready to try stuff. And then based on what we learn there, the social proof and the evidence of what works, the data captured of what works, real results, real deadlines, real timeframes, real deliverables, that's when it'll start to get traction. That's when we'll start to see more folks adopting it and embracing it. And that's kind of just a very high level way of looking at it. I'm going to jump ahead to, I'm going to skip, there's a lot of stuff around how culture actually works. The idea of building a very simple data model using some type of research where, for sure that you're not talking about engagement or employee experience, which is important, but still not culture. Climate, in addition to engagement, lots of factors in climate in addition to engagement, but still not culture. The culture is the norms and expectations and patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking that are deep in the history or deep in the operating model of the company. You can't get to it just by looking at engagement. So that's why the idea of thinking that this is a proxy for culture, you can use it as a proxy for culture. It's just not it's not the best way to look at it. It's like using a stethoscope instead of an MRI to look at, what matters most here. So plenty of companies that do it. Excellent works largely with human synergistics because it's got a 4 or 5 decade globally researched normed database of the 120 behavioral norms that matter the most, with a very simple model that helps structure it into clusters that every executive can understand, every executive can work with to understand what's the blue is good, red and green, not so good. Red and green create a lack of psychological safety, create environments that get in the way of effectiveness, constructive cultures, deliver high on achievement, high on standards of excellence, high on self-actualizing, growth, encouragement, relationships, trust, all the things everybody says they want, all possible. Around the world, folks largely agree on that model, what works. So the intuitive nature of leadership, I give lots of credit to leaders. You don't get to be a leader in a big company without having a really good intuition about how to be a good sociologist. These are some extra tools that help you be even better. The technical tools that help you see how does our ideal culture match up to our current culture, and how does my personal leadership style contribute to that? Where are the gaps? What do I personally need to work on to be an exemplar of learning and teaching of other folks in the organization for where we need to close the gap and what we need to do differently? Look what I'm learning and experimenting to do differently and better. Here's how we can close the gap across the globe. A simple model with red, green, and blue across the 12 styles, 120 behaviors can be measured by region, can be brought together in a way that it's not hard to measure, that it's easy to make meaning from, and it's easy to go explore how we make the trajectory from the anomalies, the similarities, to get moving in the direction of what we say we want, how to get moving towards the ideal culture that we say we want, and how to simplify it down to a very simple from to statement. The simplified from to statement gives us all the ammunition we need, all the backdrop we need to then go build prototypes and experiments that help us move from here to there, first in the context of my own behavior and mindset, second in the context of teams. So if we're looking at, and here's where Prototyp comes in. So you don't have to be the super expert on culture, but you do have to, on all the technical nuances, right? CXOs, you got plenty of other things to focus on besides now adding to it the technical, deepest technical competencies of culture. You do need to know enough, especially like how culture is built. Culture is built through shared learning and mutual experience. I'm going to repeat that. Culture is built through shared learning and mutual experience. So the way to change culture is to design shared learning experiences, to practice with shared learning experiences on yourself and with others, to get into an innovation methodology, mindset, and lifestyle, which is how do I test and learn over and over and over again to continue making progress on the things that I care about most. Culture is built through shared learning and mutual experience. We talked about the social learning theories. We're talking now about, okay, this is the lever to change culture. So while we have parallel improvement paths going on, delivering on the from to shift, right? Without the clarity and alignment, we don't know what the from to shift is. Without the data rich, qual and quant upfront work to get past the anecdotal to very specific levers of what's happening in our culture, where is it working well, where is it not working well, lots of things we can learn from all those nuances. Now, once we agree on the from to shift, now we can say, great, now we need a plan of action that is improvement planning. And those improvement planning efforts need to go across 3 paths simultaneously. Yes, you're going to work on improved operating model topics like systems, structures, many of the procedures, policies, things that came up in some of the culture and climate study will inform where are some key levers to focus on in the operating model. Next, under the refined team approach, this is where we have to start to think about how do we want to interact differently in teams? How do we want to deal with hierarchy? How do we want to communicate up, communicate down? What do we need to change so that we can collaborate and speak up, take initiative, take ownership, and change the way where it's not working? How do we need to change our team approach? And the other last simultaneous approach path towards improvement is leadership development. That's the working on the I, right? The individual. 2 is working on the team, the we. And the improved operating model is the overall organization. And this whole piece right here, when we talk about prototypes, spans across 2 and 3. First, starting with yourself as the learning exemplar. So you have empathy and understanding of what a prototype and experiment looks like when you're trying to be more constructive. So you can be more effective, you can change the thinking patterns and the behavior patterns. That's what culture is. We need to change those based on the data. This is where we focus the experiments. Now let's just jump right into what do we mean by prototype. Culture change is easier when we prototype. Most leaders, most organizations, when it comes to culture change, need support across 2 major fronts. The inner game, which is shifting the mindsets, right? From our current level to a next level, more effective, more open aperture, able to see more perspectives, able to hold multiple ideas in their mind at the same time without being reactive and short-circuiting, so that we can then have way more options and choose what we do next. More options leads to better choices, better decision-making, and better strategy, better results. We need help on the from-to mindset, building those mindsets in order to be the foundation for sustainable behavior change. All the behavior change directives and checklists and bullet points and mechanisms that you could learn, behavior things you could learn, those things don't get very much traction when you don't have the right mindset, if you're still operating from mindsets that keep you trapped in old ways of thinking. So first, we all need help with the inner game of transformation, and we need help with the outer game of execution. How do we in real life experiences, real life context of business, apply those mindset shifts and change the way we engage with others, lead the organization, and translate all of that mindset work and behavior work into new results. We all need help with these two fronts. We all come to it at different stages of development, so we're all at different places. We need room in our culture to make it okay to start learning from wherever you're at. I'm at a different stage of development than you are, and you are, and you are. It's all good as long as we're all moving towards better, towards more constructive. So these are the two major fronts. We have to prototype them simultaneously. We need to build ways of doing this at the same time together. So prototypes are low risk, shared learning experiences. That's what they are. It's an early model of something to come. So it's an MVP, and we accelerate results before we scale. The versions of success that we learn become more widely adopted because they work, because we like them, and we like them because they work. Even if we don't like them at first, as long as we eventually like them, it's cool. And we're going to like them if they work, if they help us be successful in our job. Plenty of precedents for this idea of prototyping working, being the most effective way to change business. Everybody knows about the big three innovation methodologies available to everybody. It's all documented. It's all free on the internet, video, process documentation, etc. Design thinking, agile, lean startup are three of the more popular, more widely talked about innovation methodologies. All of them, I would say, which focus on products and services and mash together, are in a very simplistic way of talking about it. The idea is very simple. The idea is to test and learn. The idea is a repurposed version of the scientific method, test and learn. We said before, where does all the learning, where does the intelligence come from? Learning, your social learning theory in the context of the system of the business of work. How do we go about it? We need to prototype more quickly. We need to get into this active learning cycle more quickly, because the idea of the work is done is simple. The execution part is complex. Nobody can predict what's going to happen. We can only speculate how human beings in the context of work, in different environments, under different situations, are going to behave and react and respond, adopt, or resist some of these experiments, some of these new ways of working we think might be better. We don't know if they're going to work. We believe they will, but we have to try them out to see what works under what context. So innovation methodologies, everybody knows about, widely available inside of your multinational organizations. They work, without question, they work. Applying it to human beings, if we think about it more from an experiential learning cycle, an active learning cycle, some of the widely accepted, Kolb's is a very widely accepted version of the cycle of learning. We don't get into the details of it, but the idea of innovation methodologies and building upon the adult development learning cycles is how we build a culture prototype. And quite simply, culture prototype is just leveraging all of this to get into quick, lightweight processes for learning, where we are hypothesizing what we want to change, why we want to change it, how we think we want to change it, right? The experiment design, we have to put it into action, learn by really experiencing it in the context of business, in a meeting, in a jam session, in a phone call, in a strategy session. How do these different norms play out? And we have to, based on our experiment design, be ready to capture data about it, right? We have to be prepared. We can't just be thrashing around trying stuff like a crazy person. We have to be thoughtful experimenters with a process and a plan for capturing the learning, the data, so that when we get into the high quality reflection mode, and we're metabolizing the learning and the experience, we need to be able to use real data to say, here's what happened when we did this differently, when we made time for connection at the beginning of a meeting instead of just jamming right into the work, when we made time to pay attention to each other, when we made time to listen to each other, made time to ask questions, to clarify across multinational organizations who speak English because headquarters is in the US somewhere, and you've adopted English as your native language, when 80% of the population of human beings don't live in the US and it's not their native language, do we understand the dynamics of what happens when business is done in English with largely non-native speaking, non-English native speaking folks? Do we understand clearly how that affects the culture, how that affects the speak up culture, how it affects our willingness to share our ideas, and how it even affects the way some people look at the broken English or not perfect English like the gringos have, as that means a lower level of intelligence. Like there's all kinds of subconscious things happening in the culture, in the meeting, on the phone call, in the email, that if you experiment, you can start to unpack it and find where the levers are and find what makes a difference. This whole idea of innovation methodology, MVP, active learning cycle, because that's how adults learn. You need the time, the deliberate time put aside for the high quality reflection, right? And to capture the learning before you redesign, punt, or figure out what you're going to do next. If you marry that up with also the emerging best practices around immunity to change, the body of work out of Harvard and Lisa Leahy, looking at the competing commitments underneath why really smart people don't do all the things they know they should do to get the results that they want. There's a whole body of work there, and it definitely applies to everything we already know about culture and how to relate to each other, how to be more effective at work, and how to treat each other in a way that increases trust, that increases performance, and increases our purpose-based approach to work. All of the above. There's a way to operationalize all of that, and it's largely girded by some of this immunity change work. So building a prototype that leverages all of that and experiments through it more quickly is the way to make culture change faster, easier, and include more folks because anybody can practice this. Anybody can adopt this with some minimal level of structure and framing and interest. In practicality, how this would look across a culture program, the idea of upfront, and this is like based across a year, right? This idea of you need a few months to get the clarity and alignment, to do the data-driven insights of where you're at and where you want to go, to build the quantitative, qualitative story, and even the historical story of how we got here and where we want to go to best serve our mission, our purpose, and our results and our people. You need time to include people in it so they've bought into the data beyond the anecdotes. Then it's a matter of, okay, and how do we then start to operationalize the from to shift that is the short story out of the detail into prototypes? And how do we structure it so that we're doing multiple prototypes at once? Call it a pilot, call it a sprint, whatever you want to call it. It's set up and designed to follow the active learning cycle. Hypothesize, design the experiment, run the experiment with a specific time frame in mind, specific debriefs in mind to capture the learning. All the while, you have leadership development stuff happening, because leaders say, well, I want to be the first ones to learn the new mindset stuff and the new skills, and I want to make sure we're leading the way. Great. We'll do some very direct personal work with you, very personalized, so you can be working on your individual leadership gaps that you have, mindset, behavior, all of which contribute to the overall culture, right? If you're in a position of leadership, you're influencing the culture and the performance. In many ways, you're an important symbol. And the idea that my thinking drives my behavior, which then goes out and influences the culture. And the culture comes back and influences my behavior and my thinking. So it's all wrapped up together. And there's plenty of the human synergistics model, the circumplex that I showed you with the red, green, blue is a very simple model to help capture and look at through an MRI and an easy, simple language to get into of simplifying that conversation of the complexity of what happens in the systems theory of a socio-technical system like a company. Then we get into the prototype, test and learn. You keep iterating, and the success, the real success, not in a workshop, it works. Yes, everything works in a workshop, but when you bring it out into the real world, in the context of business, we need to see what happens there. So that's why we prototype in the real context of work. And you just keep going in that direction. What makes change easier is treating it like an experiment because it's directly relevant. You got the clarity, you got the implementation, real life firsthand implementation happening. You have the very clearly defined gaps being, chiseled away at, finding what works, what doesn't work. You're approaching it in a way that's very lifestyle and long-term focused, meaning we all start to get into this lifestyle of experimentation. We get into the language of experimentation. We get into the openness of learning faster. Failure, making mistakes isn't, this terrible thing that we are afraid of, that we're going to lose our job and wind up homeless, like all those things that happen all the time inside of companies. Instead of all of that, we get into really celebrating the fact that there are gaps, because when we notice that there's a gap, we can close the gap, and there's learning to be had. It's a treasure hunt of finding ways to keep learning, and it becomes contagious. And that's also the expert way of doing it, is through deliberate practice, iterative learning, experimentation, prototyping. And that's how those new things that seem hard at first eventually become very easy. They become the new autopilot. Once we shake ourselves out of our current autopilot and pick our head up and go, wait a minute, maybe I have some more options. Let's see how these options work in real life. And then I can choose some of the new options, or I can always choose to do it the old way. But isn't it nice to have choices and options to hopefully move in the direction that we want to go, that's a more constructive culture? A very simple, I'm going to get super practical now. What does he mean by prototype? How can it be that simple? Here's a very simple way to doing it. Many leadership development programs, and whether it's the shorthand language of blue, green, and red, blue being good, red and green being bad, and it's the many organizations that have strong learning development content out there. There's in the spirit of what we call conscious business and upgrading the consciousness and the awareness of what kind of mindset are we operating out of. The learner mindset, humility, creativity, all important parts of a more constructive culture. Ownership, getting into the ability to listen to each other better, asking clarifying questions in a meeting. You can, as a prototype, as an experiment, begin to look for how people behave in the meeting. How are we interacting right now? In a way that's, I hear the language of, I don't know, I wonder, I'm curious about, do I hear the language of, questions, curiosity, exploring other people's point of views, exploring the diverse perspectives, asking why does that happen? Why do you care about that? Do we hear the language of opinions being introduced as fact or opinions as opinions? Do we see red power behavior happening, competitive, oppositional, perfectionistic? Do we see that happening in the way people are behaving and interacting? Do we see avoidance? Do we see people sitting back in their chairs and just ejecting and not talking because it's better to just be safe and just wait till the big shot is done talking and telling us what to do? All of these things can be observed as default interactions. You can stop the meeting and go, hey, I know we started this meeting saying we wanted to be better listeners and kind of really get to know each other better and understand each other's perspectives, but has anybody heard any questions happen lately? No. Interesting. Why don't we spend the rest of the meeting just being a little more conscious about whether we're curious and asking questions or not, versus being telling and being directive or ejecting from the conversation. And what typically happens is at the beginning of the meeting, if you just do little check marks, I'm giving you a very simple example of an experiment. I could, but at the beginning of the meeting, start keeping track, because I'm looking for these things, of what the default interactions were. Then with awareness, whether you've been taught and trained in all these different mindsets and behaviors or not, which would definitely be injected into a team prototype, right? You'd have those things being learned together. With awareness, all of a sudden you can see the energy and behaviors and interactions shift. And then at the end of this type of experiment, you can also debrief with everybody and go, was it better the first half of the meeting or the second half of the meeting? Did we get through the important stuff more effectively? Did we make decisions more quickly? Did we get to high quality debate? Did we do the things we said we wanted to do with greater awareness or with less awareness autopilot? And it's, of course, more awareness leads to better outcomes. So that's a simple example the last bit here is great, great. Back to the earnings analyst conversation. How does the data and the prototypes translate back to outcomes and what matters most from an ROI standpoint? How do we connect aggressive defensive patterns of behavior, passive defensive patterns of behavior, and constructive patterns of culture to the outcomes we want? As an example, the human synergistics model, 5 decades of studying global patterns throughout organizations and results. The more constructive organizations, whether you agree on the passive defensive or aggressive defensive behaviors or not, due to societal values, right? Some geographies treat hierarchy differently, treat power differently. Put those aside for a second. Every organization, every geography, every society winds up agreeing more blue is better. Focus on these constructive prototypes, building more blue individually and collectively. You will get these better outcomes. You will see over time the ROI over a short amount of time, because you're studying small groups, small teams. You're seeing the results live. You're seeing ROI at the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level. These things can all be tracked and studied. You can watch soft and hard metrics, short-term and long-term. All that stuff can be tracked. The interaction between people is the business. The interaction between people is the culture. Prototypes are the easiest, fastest, most, I think, deepest way to create the culture change we say we want, and widely proven approaches to making change happen through innovation and adult development in terms of learning styles. Zach, we can stop there. That's probably a good point to kind of bring it full circle from the earnings conversations to raising it up in terms of the importance and the understanding and the cultural intelligence and cultural competency of how it contributes directly to the business results and how prototypes play a part in it. Again, don't focus so much on changing. That creates unnecessary stress, and you can't just change just by saying change, and you can't mandate change, right? We can invite it, we can experiment with it, and if we just focus on learning, we become changed by the process of learning, hence a faster culture change.
Awesome, thanks. That was a ton of great information, and I'm definitely going to look through that slide deck again to get some more notes. But yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to throw those in the chat right now. We have a few minutes left. We'll post the recording and the slide decks in the group in our digital community, so you can review all this as well. Yeah, any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll give you a couple minutes here.
Yeah, that was a lot, and it was fast.
A lot of good information, definitely.
Yeah, hopefully it like a good prototype, it creates enough curiosity to keep exploring what might be in there for you to try that you haven't tried before, what might be worth experimenting with.
Looks like we have one question from Nicole. Can you share one real life example of what someone prototyped and the result?
Yeah, you mean, so in addition to the one I just shared, which was kind of the meeting behaviors that you can identify that are high leverage. I mean, the primary prototypes, we start by saying, we're going to prototype with ourselves. So think of yourself as an innovation project, and I'm going to experiment on myself, new habits, behaviors related to even focusing on my own mindset. So the approach of working on yourself as the prototype first, and then work branching off into teams. And again, the team example was, how do we increase perhaps the collaboration, the constructive nature of how we work together? How do our meetings go when we work on connection first, before context, before content? So that's a simple example of a real life experiment. Companies, teams, over a 90-day sprint, started working on in the first 30 days, okay, let's try framing the way we gather differently. Here's a list of different ways to approach framing your meetings differently. Connection before context before content. What is connection before content? What does that mean? Well, connect, we actually build in time, whether it's 1 minute or 10 minutes to connect with each other. You have a check-in question. So you build in some relationship up front. Then you have context, really good context beyond just the agenda. You connect to the purpose of the meeting. Is this a decide meeting? Is this a ideate meeting? Is this a transmit and update meeting? Context, what and the agenda. And is that okay with you? Is there anything else you hope we would cover in this meeting? Okay, then we get into content and you close with the checkout. So I'm giving you a simple example. The way you frame meetings changes culture. The way you engage in dialogue and conversations, one conversation at a time, changes culture. But you have to, the only way to show, to demonstrate, to prove that it changes culture, to MVP it, is to document some level of, I think if I frame my meetings differently, hypothesis, then we will increase trust. We will increase understanding. We'll increase productivity. We'll increase ownership of our objectives and the output. Okay. Try framing it differently. What framing works? What framing doesn't work? Under what situations? In what teams? That's a very straightforward, and companies over time with the documentation will show that they increase decision-making by this many days, that without this type of muscles and mindsets added, infused into the organization, we would have never had the debate that got us to this big idea, that got us away from this huge risk. And I'll put in the deck that you can download many examples of the types of benefits that were discovered by infusing the culture with the mindsets and the skill sets of interacting that they didn't have before, or they had before but just didn't operationalize as frequently as they would like. Everybody here on the call, I would say, you all have blue tendencies and blue constructive cultures. The idea is, how do we be more blue when we need it most? How do we build more trust? How do we build the environment where people really can bring their full selves to it, where we really can hold unassimilated diversity, where we really can achieve more than we've achieved before, because we're not caught in distracting drama. We're not caught in, the water cooler conversations that we never have in person, because it just doesn't feel safe to have those conversations in person. So I have it behind the scenes, and we have all this unclean escalation that goes on, which creates fear and uncertainty in politics. Like, all that stuff's happening all the time. And in many ways, we're pretty good at not having it, paralyze us. So, but what benefits might come if we could do that more often? What could we learn from all of that?